Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. The winter wind howled through the narrow streets of the Bronx that night, carrying with it the faint scent of coal smoke and rain. Inside a modest tenement, a young man named Gaetano Reina sat quietly at his kitchen table, his sleeves rolled up, his dark eyes fixed on a deck of worn playing cards spread across the wood. The cards weren't for fun. They were for thought, for strategy, for the quiet calculation that had already set him apart from other immigrants who had come to America chasing the dream. He wasn't born to play games. He was born to win them. Born in Corleone, Sicily, Gaetano had grown up in a world where silence meant survival and respect meant everything. His father was a man who believed in dignity, in the kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. When Gaetano stepped off the ship at Ellis Island in the early 1900s, he carried nothing but that lesson, and the kind of ambition that burned slow but hot, like coal under steel. In the crowded streets of East Harlem, he started small. A fruit stand, a few helpers, nothing illegal, nothing loud. But those who paid attention noticed that Gaetano had something rare: discipline. While others chased quick scores or got drunk on power, he moved quietly, helping neighbors, paying fair wages, and never letting anger make his decisions. People began to trust him. In a city where everyone was out for themselves, trust was gold. By 1915, Gaetano Reina had become more than a man who sold fruit. He was a man people came to for advice, for protection, for peace. Disputes between families, over business, over pride, were brought to him. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, his words carried weight. Violence, he once told a younger man who'd gotten into a street fight, is what fools use when they run out of ideas. He didn't crave chaos like so many others did. He wanted stability, a world where men could work, earn, and feed their families without fear. That was what made him different from the others rising in the shadows of New York's underworld. Still, the streets had a way of pulling every man toward the same center. By the 1920s, prohibition had turned small-time hustlers into overnight kings. Liquor flowed like gold through the city, and where gold flowed, blood followed. Gaetano wanted no part of it, at least not at first. But when he saw how quickly the world was changing, how the honest work was drying up and corruption was the new economy, he realized something. If he didn't adapt, he'd be buried. So he adapted. He didn't run speakeasies or throw wild parties like others did. He didn't wear flashy suits or pose for photos in nightclubs. Instead, he built a network. Quiet men, reliable men, men who understood loyalty and silence. He became known as a man who could move anything, goods, liquor, money, without leaving a trail. His operations stretched from the Bronx to Brooklyn, and even the bigger names, Luciano, Mafia, Maranzano, started to notice. But Gaetano wasn't a gambler. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't chasing fame or fear. He built something cleaner, steadier. He looked after his people, made sure widows got their rent paid, made sure kids went to school. He'd come from nothing and never forgot what that felt like. To those around him, he was more than a boss. He was Don Gaetano. Still, in a city like New York, peace was a luxury that didn't last. As the Italian underworld began splitting into factions, the whispers of war spread like smoke through alleyways and back rooms. Joe Mafia, the self-proclaimed boss of all bosses, wanted control of every racket in the city. His rivals, men like Salvatore Maranzano, believed the old ways should rule. And right in the middle of it all stood Gaetano Reina. He wanted no part in their power games, but neutrality in that world was as dangerous as defiance. Both sides wanted his loyalty, and both believed they had the right to demand it. In the smoky back rooms of Bronx cafes, messages came wrapped in politeness but laced with threat. Mafia would like a word. Maranzano has a business offer. Reina kept his calm. playing the same game he had since his fruit stand days, listening, waiting, thinking 3 moves ahead. But deep down he knew something was coming, something he couldn't talk his way out of this time. One night, as he stood by the window of his modest home, watching the snow fall over the Bronx, his wife Angelina asked softly, "Do you ever wish we'd stayed in Sicily?" Gaetano smiled faintly, his gaze still fixed on the streetlights glowing in the distance. "No," he said. "In Sicily, a man dies for a mistake. Here, he dies for being too good at what he does." She didn't understand what he meant then, but soon she would, because as the city slept, the lines were being drawn. And the quiet man from Corleone, the one who had tried to stay neutral, to build without blood, was about to find himself at the center of a storm that would change the history of New York forever. And for the first time in a long time, Gaetano Reina could feel the cold breath of danger at his back. The morning light crept through the blinds of Gaetano Reina's Bronx home, casting long bars of pale gold across the floor. He sat alone at the kitchen table, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The radio in the corner hummed softly with news of the day, talk of politics, prohibition raids, and the economy. But his mind wasn't on any of it. He was thinking about a meeting he could no longer avoid. The Bronx was quieter than Manhattan, but even here, whispers carried. The streets knew things before the papers did, and lately those whispers were all about Joe, the boss, Mafia. A man with the confidence of a king and the patience of a snake. Mafia wanted unity under his control. He believed every Italian in the city should pay tribute, no matter how small their business. And anyone who refused, well, they didn't stay in business long. Reina had managed to keep Mafia at a distance. For years, he'd done business on his own terms, respected by all, beholden to none. But that independence was starting to look like defiance. That afternoon, as Reina made his way to a quiet restaurant on Arthur Avenue, he noticed the same faces on the corners, men he didn't know, men watching. By the time he stepped through the restaurant door, the air felt heavier, charged. At a corner table sat Mafia's men, thick-necked, silent, the kind who didn't smile unless they were told to. "Don Reina," one of them greeted, motioning for him to sit. "The boss sends his regards." Reina gave a polite nod and sat down, his eyes steady. "Then send mine in return." The man leaned forward, his tone friendly, but the kind of friendly that came with a price. "Mr. Mafia respects you. He wants to make sure you're properly represented in this city. You understand?" "I represent myself," Reina said calmly. "Always have." The man smiled thinly. "That's admirable, but independence can be misunderstood." Reina looked at him for a long moment before replying. "I've always believed that respect should be earned, not bought." The silence that followed said more than words ever could. Reina finished his espresso, placed a few dollars on the table, and left. He didn't need to be told what that meeting meant. He'd just drawn a line, and in their world, lines were dangerous things. Later that evening, Reina paid a quiet visit to one of his oldest friends, Tommy Galliano, a man with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. They'd built much of the Bronx's quiet empire together, and Tommy knew when something was wrong. "Mafia won't stop," Reina said, pacing slowly. "He thinks he owns us all, and if we say no long enough, he'll make an example out of someone." Tommy nodded. "Then maybe it's time we find someone stronger than him to stand behind." That someone was Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist who'd come to New York preaching the old ways, the ways of structure, discipline, and order. He wanted to restore honor to a world that had become too loud, too greedy. Reina respected that, and though he'd tried to stay neutral, the choice was becoming clearer by the day. Still, the decision weighed on him. He'd built his life on balance, on staying out of unnecessary wars. But the storm between Mafia and Maranzano wasn't something that could be avoided forever. It was swallowing everyone, and neutrality now looked like weakness. A few nights later, Reina attended a small dinner in Little Italy, neutral ground. The air smelled of roasted garlic and red wine, and laughter echoed from nearby tables, masking the tension in the back room. Maranzano himself was there, his sharp eyes studying Reina from across the table. "Don Reina," Maranzano said in Italian, his voice smooth but cold. "You are a man of respect. I have no wish to see your family caught in the chaos that is coming, but Masseria's greed will destroy everything we've built. I intend to stop him, with men of honor at my side." Reina leaned back, weighing every word. "And when the dust settles, what then? Another man calls himself boss of bosses." Maranzano gave a faint smile. "No, there will be order. There will be rules." Rules. That word lingered in Reina's mind as he left the restaurant. He'd grown up in a world ruled by unwritten codes: loyalty, silence, respect. If Maranzano truly wanted to restore those principles, maybe it was worth the risk. But in the shadows, others were already watching his every move. To Masseria's men, Reina's meeting with Maranzano looked like betrayal. To Maranzano's men, his hesitation looked like doubt. Reina didn't yet realize that in trying to preserve peace, he had stepped directly into the crossfire of two ruthless powers, men who would burn half of New York just to rule the ashes. That night, as he walked home through the quiet Bronx streets, snow beginning to fall once again, Gaetano Reina couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. He stopped at the corner, looked over his shoulder, but saw nothing. Just shadows and silence. Still, the unease didn't fade. He knew too much about how these things went. Once whispers started, they didn't stop until someone was gone. And deep down in that cold wind, he felt something shift. A silent warning that the balance he'd built his whole life was starting to crumble. For the first time in years, Gaetano Reina realized he wasn't sure if he'd live long enough to fix it. The Bronx winter of 1930 was cruel. The wind sliced through the streets, carrying with it the smell of coal, exhaust, and fear. In the tenements, families huddled around stoves for warmth. But in the smoke-filled back rooms of cafes and butcher shops, another kind of cold was spreading, one made of mistrust and quiet threats. And for Gaetano Reina, the silence was deafening. He had built his empire on calm and reason, on staying out of petty rivalries. But now he could feel the walls closing in. Both Joe Masseria and Alwai Salvatore Maranzano were watching him closely, each believing that the calm dawn of the Bronx would soon pick a side. The problem was he already had, though no one knew for certain which. That uncertainty was dangerous. At his kitchen table one morning, Reina sat with his most trusted men. Tommy Galliano, Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Pinzolo, discussing their next move. The steam from their coffee cups curled into the air like ghosts, and no one spoke louder than a whisper. "Masseria's people are asking questions," Lucchese said, tapping his finger nervously. "They want to know why you've been meeting with Maranzano's men." Reina looked at him, calm as ever. "Because I'm tired of paying tribute to a man who believes respect can be bought with fear." Pinzolo frowned. "You think Maranzano's any different? He talks about honor, but he wants the same thing: control." Reina leaned back in his chair. "Maybe, but at least Maranzano has rules. Masseria just wants chaos he can profit from." Galliano spoke up, his tone quiet but firm. "You know he won't forgive this, Gaetano. If he even suspects you're with Maranzano, you'll be next." Reina's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply right away. He knew his friend was right. In this world, perception was everything, and loyalty, once questioned, was a death sentence. That evening, Reina drove alone through the Bronx, the city lights reflecting off the icy streets. His thoughts were heavy, his hands gripping the wheel tighter with every turn. He wasn't a young man anymore, and he had no taste for war. He'd built his reputation on keeping peace, not starting battles. But now, peace seemed like a luxury only fools believed in. He parked outside a small bakery, a place he owned quietly through a relative, and stepped inside. The warm air hit him immediately, filled with the smell of bread and sugar. The baker, an older man from Palermo, nodded respectfully. "Don Reina," he said softly. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Reina smiled faintly. "I like to remind myself what normal looks like once in a while." But even as he said it, he could feel eyes on him. Across the street, a car idled too long, exhaust rising into the night air. Reina's instincts, sharpened by years of reading danger before it came, told him everything he needed to know. He stayed only a few minutes longer before returning home, every step deliberate. Inside his house, his wife Angelina looked up from her sewing, sensing his tension immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then said, "I think Mafia is starting to move." Her hands froze on the fabric. "Then leave the city, Gaetano. Take us away. You have money, friends. You don't have to stay here." Reina walked to the window, staring out into the night. The street lamps cast long shadows over the snow. "If I run, they'll hunt us no matter where we go. If I stay, maybe I can control it." She came to his side, her voice trembling. "Control it? These men have no hearts, Gaetano. You taught others to stay calm, to stay fair. But these men don't care about fairness." He turned, cupping her face gently. "Then maybe I'll remind them what respect used to mean." But deep down he knew that wasn't true anymore. The new generation of gangsters didn't care about the old ways. They cared about power, money, and fear. And men like Reina, men who stood for something, were becoming extinct. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew unbearable. Rumors spread that Mafia had sent word. "Reina's finished." His men were followed, his businesses watched. Gaetano urged him to lay low, but Reina refused to disappear like a coward. He'd faced worse and survived. Then came the final straw. One night, Tommy Lucchese arrived at Reina's house, pale and shaking. "I heard something," he whispered. "From inside Masseria's camp. He's ordered a hit. He thinks you're going to flip to Maranzano any day now." Reina didn't flinch. He'd expected it. Still, hearing it said aloud made the air feel heavier. "Who's doing it?" he asked. Lucchese hesitated. "They didn't say, but it's someone close, someone who can get near you." Reina's gaze drifted toward the window again. Snow had started to fall outside, soft, gentle, almost peaceful. He thought about his wife, his children asleep in their rooms, unaware of the danger closing in. He nodded slowly. "Then it's decided. Tomorrow, I'll go speak to Mafia myself. Man to man." Lucchese's eyes widened. "That's suicide, Gaetano." Reina shook his head. "No. Suicide is waiting here, pretending silence will save me." When Lucchese left that night, Reina stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't afraid of dying. What he feared was leaving the world worse than he found it, a world where men forgot honor entirely. He reached for his rosary, the same one his mother had given him in Sicily years. Go and whispered a prayer under his breath. Outside, the Bronx slept in uneasy silence. But somewhere in the shadows, an engine idled, and two men whispered his name. They weren't waiting for orders anymore. They were waiting for the right moment. And by the time the first light of morning touched the snow, the clock had already started ticking on Gaetano Reina's final hours. The morning of February 26th, 1930, was cold and gray, the kind of day where the city felt half asleep. Ice clung to the curbs, the air heavy with the scent of rain and exhaust. Gaetano Reina woke before dawn, as he always did, his thoughts already miles ahead. He sat at the kitchen table, quietly tying his tie, while his wife brewed coffee behind him. Neither spoke much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in whispers and worried looks. Angelina placed a steaming cup beside him. "Do you really have to go?" she asked softly. Reina gave a faint smile, the kind that tried to comfort but never reached the eyes. You know me, Lena. I don't hide from men. She wanted to argue, but she knew it was useless. He'd made up his mind. For 20 years, she'd watched him handle disputes with calm, turn chaos into order, and stand firm when others lost their heads. But this time felt different. This wasn't a business disagreement. It was a storm he couldn't talk his way through. As Reina left the house, his overcoat buttoned tight against the cold, he glanced once more at his home, at the faint curtain glow of his children's room. He paused for a moment, just long enough to breathe in the quiet, before heading toward his car. The Bronx streets were still half empty, a thin layer of frost coating the pavement. He drove slowly, taking familiar routes through Arthur Avenue and Belmont, every corner carrying memories of the empire he had built, legitimate businesses, honest workers, and men who once believed in rules. But now, even his own drivers were wary, speaking little, their eyes darting toward passing cars. Halfway across town, Reina stopped by a small cafe run by a family he trusted. Inside, the heat and smell of espresso gave a brief illusion of normalcy. He sat near the back, his hat low, scanning the morning paper. Across the front page, "Gangland Wars Intensify." He smirked to himself. They called it a war, but to him, it felt more like a sickness, one that had spread too far to cure. Not long after, his trusted friend, Tommy Galliano, entered, his breath clouding in the cold air. He approached Reina's table and spoke in a low voice. "I heard something from one of Maranzano's men," he said. "Mafia knows you're leaning toward Salvatore. He's not going to talk anymore, Gaetano. He's sending someone tonight." Reina didn't even look surprised. "Then I was right to come here. I'll speak to Mafia first." Galliano frowned deeply. "He won't listen. He's too proud. You know how this ends." Reina folded the newspaper and stood up. "Maybe, but I still have to try." He left the cafe without finishing his coffee. Galliano watched him go, his heart heavy, knowing he might never see his old friend again. By late afternoon, Reina drove toward his Bronx ice company, a business front that doubled as a meeting place. The streets had grown busier, trucks rumbling past, shopkeepers sweeping snow from their doorsteps. He parked near a quiet intersection, stepping out into the chill. He didn't know it, but a black Hudson sedan had been following him since he left home. Inside it sat a man who had once been close, a man Mafia trusted, who had been ordered to make sure Reina never made it to that meeting. Reina straightened his coat, unaware. He looked older than his 50 years, the lines around his eyes carved by decades of tension and responsibility. Yet his step was steady, his head high. He crossed the street toward the house of a friend, one last stop before heading to speak with Mafia. He was almost to the door when the air changed. A car door slammed behind him. Reina turned slightly, just enough to see a familiar face leaning out of the window, hand rising. There was no shout, no warning, just the sharp crack of a gun echoing down the quiet Bronx street. For an instant, everything froze. The sound, the air, even the falling snow. Then the world rushed back in. A scream from a nearby shop, the screech of tires, the fluttering of pigeons scattering into the sky. The black Hudson was gone before anyone reached him. By the time a passerby ran to his side, Gaetano Reina, the quiet don of the Bronx, was already gone. News of his death spread through the underworld like wildfire. Some said Mafia had ordered it personally, furious that Reina had chosen to side with Maranzano. Others whispered it was someone closer, a man who had turned to save himself. No one knew for sure, and those who did never talked. That night, the Bronx was eerily still. Men gathered in dark rooms, speaking in low tones about what it meant. Some wept, others began calculating what would happen next. But the one thing everyone agreed on was this: with Reina gone, a new kind of war had just begun. In his home, Angelina sat by the window, still waiting. She hadn't yet heard the news. The clock ticked steadily, the same way it always had, as if time itself refused to acknowledge what the streets already knew, that the man who had once kept balance in a world built on chaos was gone. And in the quiet that followed, as the city prepared for another night of unrest, it became clear that Gaetano Reina's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. Men like him, measured, loyal, honorable, were disappearing, replaced by wolves who called themselves kings. And in the dark corners of the city, the next generation, Luciano, Genovese, Lucchese, watched carefully, already planning what would come next. Because in New York, death was never the end. It was only the start of someone else's story. The morning after Gaetano Reina's death, New York woke to whispers thick as fog. The newspapers used careful words. Bronx businessman found slain. But everyone who mattered already knew. It wasn't business. It was blood politics, the kind that redrew the lines of power overnight. In a small back room above a bakery on 187th Street, Tommy Gagliano, Tommy Lucchese, and a few loyalists gathered in silence. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and grief. Gagliano's eyes were red, not from tears. He wasn't the crying kind, but from sleeplessness. Reina had been more than a boss. He had been his mentor, the man who showed him how to survive without losing himself. Lucchese leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "We can't sit still. Mafia thinks we'll bow down now, that we'll join him or get buried next." Gagliano didn't answer right away. He stared at the wooden table, tapping his fingers softly. "We moved too soon. We're finished. He's expecting us to strike back." Lucchese smirked bitterly. "Then what? We do nothing? Let him pick off whoever he wants?" Gagliano finally looked up, his voice steady. "No. We wait for the right ally. Reina didn't die for us to rush into the same grave." The room went quiet again. Outside, the city buzzed like normal. Streetcars clanging, kids shouting, bread carts rolling down icy streets. But up here, time felt heavy. Word of Reina's murder reached Salvatore Maranzano in Brooklyn by the afternoon. When his men brought the news, he didn't speak for several seconds. He simply removed his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, and said, "Mafia will answer for this." Maranzano was a man who believed in symbols. Reina had represented restraint, balance, a code that even criminals respected. Killing him wasn't just murder, it was a declaration that the old ways were dying. Meanwhile, in Little Italy, Giuseppe Mafia sat in his favorite restaurant, rolling dice across the table with a grin. Reina was a good man, he said mockingly to his men. Too bad he chose the wrong friends. He poured himself a drink, satisfied. He thought his message was clear. Betray me, and you're done. But he didn't realize that he'd just sown the seeds of his own downfall. For weeks after, Reina's funeral drew an uneasy crowd. The church was packed with men in dark coats, faces grim, eyes cautious. Some came to pay respects, others came to count who showed up. FBI agents lurked at a distance, jotting down license plates, whispering into their notebooks. Angelina Reina sat front row, her black veil trembling with every quiet sob. Her children clung to her sides. Behind her, Gagliano stood like a stone, watching each mourner file past. Lucchese whispered from beside him, "Look at them. Half of these men probably helped Mafia plan it." Gagliano's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but we'll know soon enough who's still with us." After the funeral, a private meeting was held in a warehouse basement, one that Reina had once used for legitimate deliveries. The mood was tense. "We can't replace him," one man said. "No one will follow another leader so soon." Lucchese countered, "We don't replace him. We honor him. We keep the family alive the way he would have wanted." Another man spoke up, his tone uncertain. "And what if Mafia comes after us next?" Gagliano looked around the room, his voice calm but cold. Then we let him come, because when he does, we'll be ready. And quietly, a plan began to form, one that would eventually align them with Lucky Luciano and the reformers who wanted to end the senseless war tearing the city apart. In the months that followed, Reina's absence reshaped the underworld. His former allies, Gaetano and Lucchese, moved carefully, slowly gathering strength. They rebuilt the Bronx operation piece by piece, avoiding open fights, letting the other families exhaust themselves. Mafia, on the other hand, became reckless, paranoid. Every man he met, he suspected of betrayal. His table grew smaller, his nights longer. He trusted fewer people, until finally, he trusted the wrong ones. By 1931, whispers began to circulate through the city's back alleys and speakeasies. Luciano was making moves. He was tired of being caught between two old-world bosses, Mafia and Maranzano. Reina's death had been a lesson to him. The old ways only led to blood and ruin. And so, when Luciano reached out quietly to Gaetano and Lucchese, it wasn't with threats. It was with a promise. "Help me end this war," he said, "and I'll make sure Reina's legacy isn't forgotten." Gaetano agreed without hesitation. Reina's name still carried weight among the older men, and Luciano knew that aligning with them would bring not just muscle, but credibility. While the war raged between the two titans, Mafia and Maranzano, Gaetano's Bronx crew played both sides carefully, feeding information here, lending favors there, but never exposing themselves. By spring, Luciano's betrayal of Mafia was in motion. Gaetano didn't take part directly. He didn't have to. His job was to make sure the Bronx stayed quiet when the storm hit. And when it did, it was over almost instantly. One April afternoon in 1931, Mafia sat at a Coney Island restaurant, enjoying cards and clams, when Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, the shots rang out, quick and final. The headlines the next morning spoke of another gangster slain, but to those in the shadows, it was the sound of change. Gaetano read the paper in silence, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He looked to Lucchese and said, "It's done. Now we rebuild." Lucchese nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. Reina would have liked that. Gaetano gave a quiet nod. He started something bigger than he knew. Now it's up to us to finish it. That day, under the cover of calm skies and soft rain, the first seeds of what would become the Lucchese families were planted. And though Reina's grave was still fresh, his shadow lingered over everything they did. Because even in death, Gaetano Reina's legacy, his loyalty, restraint, and quiet authority, continued to guide the men who came after him. The city had changed, but the memory of the man who once ruled the Bronx with honor refused to fade. And for those who remembered him, every whispered deal, every cautious alliance, carried one thought. Gaetano Reina might have been taken too soon, but his code still lived on, in the men who refused to forget him. The spring of 1930 arrived in New York like a cruel joke. Bright skies above, blood and betrayal below. The streets were loud with the sound of delivery trucks, trolley bells, and laughter spilling out of corner cafes. But beneath it all, the underworld was cracking. In the Bronx, Gaetano Reina's men walked like ghosts. They did their work quietly, collecting payments, running shipments, keeping businesses in line, but the warmth that once bound them was gone. Every deal felt watched, every handshake questioned. Reina's death had hollowed something out of them. At the center of it all stood Tommy Gaetano, trying to hold the family together with calm words and careful moves. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't bark orders or slam fists on tables. He led with patience, just as Reina had taught him. But patience could be mistaken for weakness, and Mafia was betting on that mistake. Every few days, another small operator disappeared. Some fled the city. Others simply vanished into the East River. It was a message. Join Masseria or disappear. One cold evening, Gaetano met with Tommy Lucchese. In the back of a Bronx garage, the smell of oil and smoke clung to the air. Lucchese was pacing, frustrated. "We can't keep playing defense," Lucchese snapped. "He's bleeding us slow. The men are scared." Gaetano exhaled, lighting a cigarette. "That's what he wants. Panic. The moment we act rashly, we give him an excuse to crush us." Lucchese stopped pacing, glaring. "So what do we do? Wait for him to knock again?" Gaetano's voice was low, but there was steel in it. "We wait for the right hand to play. Luciano's not staying quiet for nothing. Something's coming. When it does, we move." That was the thing about Lucky Luciano. He saw things others didn't. Where most men saw a war between Masseria and Maranzano, Luciano saw opportunity. He believed the old world, men like Masseria, were finished. He wanted something new, a system, a structure, a commission. And though Gaetano didn't yet know it, he would become one of the architects of that vision. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Salvatore Maranzano was preparing for the inevitable showdown. His soldiers, loyal and sharp, trained and plotted. Maranzano spoke of ancient Rome, of discipline and order, of structure among chaos. He admired men like Gaetano, strategists, thinkers, men who played the long game. He sent word quietly through trusted channels. "The Bronx is welcome here. Reina's men will find justice under my protection." The offer reached Gaetano through a courier late one night. He didn't respond immediately, but the seed was planted. The more Masseria pushed, the more Maranzano's side looked like salvation. One afternoon, Gaetano drove alone through the Bronx, past the old neighborhoods where Reina once walked. He saw kids playing stickball in the street, women hanging laundry, men sitting on stoops watching the world roll by. It hit him then, everything they fought over, every dollar, every risk. It all came down to keeping these streets alive. Reina had understood that. When he returned to his office, Lucchese was waiting, arms crossed. "You look like you saw a ghost." "In a way," Gaetano said softly. "Maybe it's time we stop waiting." Lucchese raised an eyebrow. "You mean?" "I mean we talked to Maranzano. Quietly, no promises, just words." Lucchese grinned. "Now you're talking my language." That night, in a dimly lit cafe in Lower Manhattan, Gaetano met one of Maranzano's lieutenants. They spoke in coded phrases, careful not to attract attention. The deal was simple: protection, respect, and recognition in exchange for loyalty when the time came. When Gaetano returned to the Bronx, the decision was made. Reina's old crew would quietly align with Maranzano, biding their time until Masseria made his final mistake. And make it he did. By late 1930, Masseria's paranoia was eating him alive. He accused allies of betrayal, demanded payments twice over, and lashed out at anyone who hesitated. Even men who once swore loyalty began slipping away, one by one, into Maranzano's camp. The streets whispered that Masseria's empire was cracking, and Gaetano's men made sure those whispers reached the right ears. In private, Gaetano began restructuring what was left of Reina's organization. He promoted Lucchese as his underboss, rewarded loyalty, and cleaned out anyone suspected of double-dealing. Reina had built his crew on trust and fairness. Gaetano built his on quiet calculation. He began making alliances with other reformers, men like Luciano, Costello, and Genovese. Together, they formed a silent network, an understanding that the war between old-world bosses would soon end, and when it did, they would be ready to build something new. But it was dangerous work. Every move had to look innocent, every word cautious. A single slip could bring Masseria's wrath crashing down. Lucchese, always the risk-taker, pushed for bolder steps. "If we back Luciano now, we'll be sitting at the table when this is over," he told Gaetano one night. Gaetano stared at the map spread across his desk. "And if we move too soon, we'll be buried before it begins. No, we wait. But when the shot comes, Tommy, we don't hesitate." And so they waited. Winter turned to spring. The city never sleeping. Men disappeared, deals shifted, and the balance of power trembled. Every night, Gaetano sat in his small office, staring at Reina's old photograph, a reminder of what had been lost and what he was fighting to preserve. Then, one cold March night, the phone rang. It was Luciano. "It's happening," Lucky said simply. "Get your men ready. Maseria's time is over." Gaetano didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply whispered, "About time." He hung up the phone and looked at Lucchese. "It's starting, and this time, we finish it for Reina." Outside, the Bronx slept under the hum of street lamps, unaware that the next few weeks would change the underworld forever. The war was reaching its end, and from its ashes, a new order was about to rise. One that would bear the quiet fingerprints of a man who never wanted a throne, but would end up shaping an empire in the shadows. The morning the call came, the Bronx was wrapped in fog thick enough to swallow sound. Inside a small cafe on Arthur Avenue, Tommy Gaetano and Tommy Lucchese sat across from each other, the smell of espresso and rain hanging in the air. They weren't celebrating, not yet. But there was a quiet tension between them, like two men who knew history was about to shift beneath their feet. "Luciano's making his move," Lucchese said, his voice barely a whisper. "Maseria won't see it coming." Gaetano stirred his coffee, eyes distant. "He'll see it. But by the time he does, it won't matter." For months, the city had been a chessboard. Luciano had worked behind the scenes, playing both sides, pretending loyalty to Maseria while secretly negotiating with Maranzano. Gaetano had stayed out of sight, letting others draw attention. That was his gift. He was invisible until he needed to be seen. And now, his patience was about to pay off. The Castellamarese War, as the papers would later call it, had drained everyone. The streets were tired of the gunfire, the constant shifting of power. Even the men involved wanted it to end. Luciano understood that. So did Gaetano. In the coming days, whispers spread like wildfire. Maseria was Teresiora. He'd been found in a Coney Island restaurant, slumped over a card table, a deck scattered on the floor. The message was clear. The old world had fallen. When word reached Gaetano, he said nothing. He just closed his office door, poured himself a drink, and sat in silence. Reina's death. All the blood that followed. It had led to this. Lucchese walked in later, excitement flickering in his eyes. "It's done, boss. Luciano's taking control. Maranzano's men are calling for peace. It's over." Gaetano looked up, expression unreadable. "It's never over, Tommy. Not really. But yes, it's the end of one war." What came next wasn't peace. It was restructuring. Luciano and Maranzano met, dividing New York into territories. No more random wars, no more chaos. 5 families, 5 bosses, one commission to oversee it all. Lucchese leaned in, voice eager. "You'll have the Bronx, Reina's old turf, your own family." Gaetano didn't react immediately. "And Maranzano?" "He'll call himself Capo di tutti capi," Lucchese said with a faint smirk. "Boss of bosses." Gaetano sighed. "Then this peace won't last long." He was right. Maranzano's ego grew quickly. He began issuing orders, inspecting crews, demanding tribute. He fancied himself a Roman emperor reborn. The younger bosses, Luciano, Genovese, Costello, were restless. They'd fought to end tyranny, not trade one tyrant for another. Still, Gaetano played his role carefully. He attended meetings, spoke little, listened much. When Maranzano praised him for his discipline, Gaetano simply nodded. He had no interest in crowns. What he wanted was longevity, control without chaos. But even as peace returned, the streets hummed with unease. Maranzano had begun keeping lists, men he didn't trust, men he planned to remove. And Luciano's name was near the top. It was Lucchese who brought the news one night. "He's going after Lucky. He's got his own hitters lined up. If he pulls it off, Everything we've built is gone. Gaetano leaned back, exhaling slowly. Then Lucky won't wait. He'll strike first. And so, just months after Masseria's fall, another boss met his end. Maranzano was cornered in his Manhattan office by men posing as federal agents. When they left, the world had changed again. Gaetano was now officially the head of what had once been the Reina family, one of the newly formed 5 families. His name carried weight, though he used it sparingly. He rebuilt what Reina had started, carefully, quietly, with precision. Lucchese, ever the ambitious one, became his right hand. The two men were opposites in many ways. Lucchese fiery and sharp, Gaetano calm and deliberate. But together, they balanced the family perfectly. Years passed, and under Gaetano's guidance, the Bronx flourished. Legitimate businesses expanded, unions grew stronger, and money flowed steadily through their operations. While other bosses made headlines for arrests and violence, Gaetano stayed invisible. That was his secret. He understood that power wasn't about noise, it was about silence. But the ghosts never truly left him. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit by the window of his modest home, a glass of red wine in hand, and think of Reina, the mentor who'd taught him that loyalty was worth more than gold. He thought about how the old man had died because of betrayal, how every peace in this world was only a pause between storms. Lucchese once asked him, "Do you ever think it was worth it? All this?" Gaetano had looked at him for a long time before answering. "It's not about worth. It's about survival. We don't build kingdoms, Tommy. We build time." That was the truth of it. Every boss, every soldier, every move, they were all just buying time before the next storm rolled in. And though Gaetano's reign would eventually fade into history, for a long while, he held something rare in the underworld: stability. He didn't need to be feared to be respected. He didn't need to shout to be obeyed. He simply existed like a steady heartbeat in the Bronx, quiet but undeniable. The world around him would keep changing. New names, new wars. But for a time, under Tommy Gaetano's hand, Reina's legacy lived on, wrapped in loyalty, silence, and a sense of order the streets hadn't seen in decades. But peace in the underworld is never eternal. Shadows were beginning to stretch again, new players, new ambitions, and the name Reina would soon become a whisper of the past as the next generation stepped forward, ready to reshape the streets once more. By the mid-1930s, the city had changed. The Depression had stripped it bare. Families huddled around radios, storefronts shuttered, men selling apples on corners for nickels. But in the Bronx, life under Tommy Gaetano moved with the rhythm of quiet control. Where others saw ruin, Gaetano saw opportunity. The unions, the trucking lines, the garment industry, all of them needed protection, stability, leadership. And that was something he could offer better than anyone else. He ran the old Reina organization like a craftsman, careful, deliberate, and utterly methodical. His men respected him not because they feared him, but because they knew he was fair. Everyone got their piece, and everyone followed the rules. No one stepped out of line. Tommy Lucchese, his loyal right hand, made sure of that. Lucchese was a different breed. Smooth-talking, charming, with a knack for turning chaos into profit. Together, the two Toms, the quiet strategist and the charismatic enforcer, built an empire of subtle power. They didn't make headlines, and that was exactly the way Gaetano wanted it. One afternoon, Gaetano met with Lucky Luciano, in a private dining room above an Italian restaurant in Midtown. The noise of the street below was faint, like a heartbeat beneath their conversation. Luciano, ever the visionary, poured wine and smiled. "You did good, Tommy," he said. "While everyone else was fighting for scraps, you built something solid. You kept your mouth shut, stayed loyal. That's rare these days." Gaetano nodded. "It's not about loyalty to men, Lucky. It's loyalty to the structure. You built something that works. I just don't intend to ruin it." Luciano chuckled. You always did see the long game. That's why I trust you. Some of these other bosses, they want to be kings. Me, I want businessmen. That conversation cemented Gaetano's place on the newly formed commission. The Council of Bosses Luciano had envisioned, a democratic table where disputes could be settled without blood. For the first time in decades, the American underworld had something resembling order, but order is fragile. In 1936, Luciano was arrested and sentenced to decades in prison after a crusade led by District Attorney Thomas Dewey.